You will find the Taj Mahal both profound and exciting, Indira cautioned me a long time later as we were strolling down Chandni Chowk. We felt that the time had come to think about lunch after our morning celebration. Lunch also meant such sweet extravaganzas as cakes, puddings, and tea. And that's what we did. We let the celebration continue at a tiny sidewalk restaurant that was called Tea Palace. The palace was located at one of the many street corners. At this particular one, a side street had been blocked off to provide space for a fenced-in outdoors area that was anything but palatial. Of course, neither of us cared about that. What we were celebrating didn't require a palatial setting, but a setting of life, and that we brought with us. It was our soaring spirit that created the background and determined the foreground all at the same time. There was joy in the air, and it was joy in celebration of something profound that had taken place. We were celebrating not merely the end of old barriers, but more profoundly the beginning of a new renaissance. The dance of our conversation had become pervaded with the idea of a new renaissance. I suspect that the Taj Mahal is to a large degree the outcome of the old Renaissance tradition that had created beautiful cities throughout Europe during the Golden Renaissance period, I said to Indira while we were waiting for our meal at the sidewalk Tea Palace. I understand that the completion of the Taj Mahal occurred in 1648, which coincides almost perfectly with the completion of the greatest spiritual achievement in European history, which likewise was built on a new renaissance in thinking. You are referring to the Treaty of Westphalia again, aren't you? Indira interjected with a grin. Few people are aware of it, though it established a new course for humanity and determined the shape of our civilization to the present day. But as you said, its principle was already known to the ancient Hindus. This makes me believe that the Taj Mahal predated the Westphalia Renaissance instead of reflecting it. It is tempting to believe that it reflects it, but this can't, because then something big doesn't add up. And that is, Indira. I can't tell you what it is. I can only show it to you, and I will show it to you. We can go there tomorrow if you want to. The train leaves at 6 in the morning. We'll have breakfast on the train. It's a 2-hour ride. We'll get there after 8. This means that we can have the whole day at the Taj. We can take the last train that leaves around 9. We'll have dinner on the train. Taking the train is much better than going by car. And having those 12 hours at the Taj, which we wouldn't have otherwise, makes for a nice visit. Is it that big, what you want to show me, that we need 12 hours? I asked. She simply nodded. But it won't be a luxury train ride, like the Palace on Wheels, she added. It will only be a normal, air-conditioned, fast train. What do you mean by Palace of Wheels, Indira? The Palace on Wheels. It's India's cruise ship on land. India's Palace on Wheels is one of the most luxurious trains in the world. The train is made up of 14 saloons, 4 coupes with 2 beds each with attached bath, shower, music channels, and specially designed furniture. Many pantries are situated in each saloon, which provide hot as well as cold beverages and refreshment throughout the journey. The train also incorporates an exquisite lounge along with a fine bar. Riding the palace is a royal treat reminiscent of the Rajput kingdoms. There are 14 coaches representing the decor of the historic empires of Jaipur, Jodhpur, Udaipur, Kota, Jaisalmer, Bundi, Bikaner, Bharatpur, Alwar, Sirohi, Kishangarh, Dungapur, Jalore, and Alpur. Each coach is made of 4 coupes ornated in the colors of the respective royal emblem, and with a variety of fantastic furniture. Of course, there is food on the train, a selection of excellent Indian delicacies, all are available in the Maharaja and Maharani restaurants on board. The train departs from Delhi and halts at Jaipur, Chittorgarh, Udaipur, Jaisalmer, Jodhpur, Bharatpur, and Agra. The traveling is done at night, and the local touring during the daytime. At every stop, the passengers are treated to the best sightseeing tours in India. How do you know all that? I interrupted her. She pointed to a brochure stuck in a holder at the center of the table. and then began to laugh. "Do you want me to read the price list?" she asked. "Why would I be interested?" I replied. "Come and see India and its pompous history, all condensed into 7 days." I began to laugh. "I'd sooner spend a single day with you in peace and tranquility at the Taj Mahal." "Isn't the Taj Mahal counted as one of the 7 wonders of the world?" I asked. "I have seen pictures of it. It really looks beautiful." "You haven't seen anything yet," Indira countered me. "Just wait, Peter." "This means getting up at 4, I said, and began to yawn. "What's wrong with getting up at the first hue of dawn, Peter? I can guarantee you it will be worth it." The moment that we came back to Indira's apartment, after from our long extended lunch celebration, she went directly to her bookcase. "Do you want me to tell you the official story of the Taj Mahal?" she asked. She searched for a book. Moments later she motioned me to come out onto the balcony with her. I couldn't help notice that the book in her hand was printed in English. It didn't say anything about the Taj Mahal being a temple of love. I asked her about it. "They left the most important detail out," she commented. "The official story of the Taj Mahal begins in 1612, said Indira, after we were seated with another cup of tea. The tea in the teapot had become cold by then, but who cared? The official story of the Taj begins in 1621 when a woman by the name of Mumtaz Mahal became married to Prince Khurram, who later became the 5th Mughal emperor, Shah Jahan. His marriage with Mumtaz Mahal is said to have been the love match of the century. She became her husband's inseparable companion. She accompanied him on all of his journeys and military expeditions, even the arduous ones. She became his comrade and his counselor. It is said that she also inspired him to acts of charity and great benevolence towards the weak and the needy. It is also a fact of history that she bore him 13 children during their marriage, and that she died at the birth of her 14th child. Her death occurred after 18 years of marriage in 1630. She died in Berhampur in the Deccan, to where she had accompanied her husband on another military campaign. The great tragedy occurred barely 3 years after her husband's accession to the throne. Moved by grief, her husband, now the great Emperor Shah Jahan, decided to perpetuate her memory for all times to come by building for his beloved wife the grandest tomb ever created on the face of the earth as a monument of his love. Indira laid the book on the table. It is being said that the sad circumstances of the Empress' early death, who had been well loved by the people, has inspired many of them to join the Emperor's intentions to build the grandest mausoleum for her that has ever been built. It took 18 years to complete the construction work, with the involvement of over 20,000 workmen and a vast transportation infrastructure of 1,000 elephants. She paused abruptly and pointed at me. "You were correct, Peter. The main construction work was completed in 1648, although some minor work dragged on till 1652. The Taj stands tall in many respects, Peter. It is built on the high banks of the river Yamuna in Agra and towers more than 240 feet above the ground. It became the jewel of Agra, of the great capital of the Mughal monarchs." "Can you imagine the coincidence?" I interrupted her. "This beautiful work being created on such a vast scale, and it being erected at the same time that Europe was tearing itself apart in the 30 Years' War? By the time the Taj Mahal was complete, Europe lay in ruins, with half the population of Europe butchered to death. However, almost as gradually as the Taj Mahal was constructed, and just as momentously, a mental monument was being raised up in Europe that overpowered the 30 Years' War in 1648 and stopped it." "The coincidence is eerie," said Indira. "It is certainly amazing how these two momentous developments unfolded side by side, half a world apart from each other, and came to completion within the same year, separated possibly by only a few months." "That's just the beginning of what they appear to have in common," I replied. "Both structures were erected as the result of a great tragedy, and both became monuments to love and to burial, with just a few minor variations between them. In India, the beloved for whom the monument was erected was a person. In Europe the beloved was humanity itself. In India the burial was the burial of grief. In Europe the burial was the burial of war. In Europe revenge was laid to rest, atrocities were forgiven, debts were cancelled, and no reparations were demanded, only peace. Today, more than 350 years after the completion, both structures, the Taj Mahal and the Treaty of Westphalia, both structures still stand. The Treaty of Westphalia stands as a world constitution that is still regarded as the foundation of modern civilization. The Taj Mahal in turn is regarded as the eighth wonder of the ancient world, and the greatest temple of love ever built. Indira cautioned me by pointing out that this is only the official story about the Taj Mahal. To me, she said, the Taj Mahal has a much higher significance. Officially the Taj Mahal is a tomb and a mosque. As a mosque, it is a religious place for prayer, but you are right, Peter, it is also a temple to love. Here, the official story begins to fracture. The concept of a tomb is contrary to the religion of Islam. Shah Jahan was an Islamic ruler. He violated Islam by building a tomb. Something doesn't add up, Peter. And something else doesn't add up that is even bigger. But this one you have to see for yourself. Getting up at 4 in the morning wasn't hard with this kind of incentive on the scene. Was this the dawn she had been referring to? I wondered. But the astrophysical dawn was also happening. Before we were on the way, Indira pointed to the north, where a faint hue appeared that was barely visible, but which was definitely the first light of the unfolding day. She said it held a golden promise, though I felt that was stretching the metaphor more than just a bit. Still, there was an advantage. The traffic was light enough so early in the day that it was worthwhile taking a taxi to the railway station. It puzzles me, said Indira, while we are having breakfast in the dining car, that America is destroying its railway infrastructure. Going by train is the best way to travel for short distances between cities. It makes no sense going by air. Short-distance air travel is expensive. It takes longer if you include ground transportation. It uses a great deal more energy and is so filled with hassles. Going by train is so easy in comparison. There's more room to sit on a train, more space to relax, and with bigger windows for looking out at the world from which one can actually see something interesting. She was right, of course. We stepped off the train almost refreshed, as if we had just stepped away from the breakfast table. The train arrived as 8:22, 10 minutes behind schedule. We had the whole day before us. As we entered the great garden of the Taj Mahal on the next day, the 7th day of our spiritual marriage celebration, Indira invited me to sit down with her on a nearby block of stone to take in the serene atmosphere that the garden setting created. The great white structure towered in the distance, which the garden had been designed to focus our attention on. We are told that the marble structure stands over 200 feet tall, said Indira. It stands on a large square marble platform that is surrounded by a marble wall. She pointed to the 4 minarets at the 4 corners of the platform. Look how tall they are. Each is a marvel in itself. They are thin, freestanding spires of perfect marble brickwork rising 138 feet above the ground. They seem to be reaching up to the very sky. Nevertheless, although they are marvels in their own right, they are shorter in height than the main dome of the tomb. The entire Taj Mahal comes to light in this way, as a complex series of marvels, each exceeding the other in almost every possible way. This holds true also visually. One of the visual marvels is that when one looks at the main structure from the level of the reflecting pool, as we will later on, the entire huge marble structure appears as if it were floating on water, and being surrounded by water, and being framed by nothing but water and the open sky. I suggested to Indira that this pattern of successive marvels, one marvel built upon the other, reflects the unfolding of scientific perception in human consciousness. Every idea that comes to light through advanced scientific perception sets the stage for grander ideas. One builds on the other and becomes a greater marvel in itself, which sets the stage for new marvels, and the greatest of them all in that sequence is the marvel that brought us together, Indira. I reached out my hand to her. It was warmly accepted. From our rather distant place in the garden, the great white structure appeared less immediate. Much of it was obscured by the garden's cypress trees that lined the walkways along the reflecting pools. The pools divided the 16 flower beds of the garden that, according to the guidebook, contained the 16 kinds of flowers into 4 groups of 4 flower beds each. From where we sat, we could see only a small portion of the garden. It was the garden with the great structure in the background that shaped the atmosphere and created a peaceful feeling. We had barely sat down on the stone block when Indira reached into her bag and gave me a present wrapped in gold-colored silk and tied with a bow made of red ribbons. "Please open it," she urged me with a smile on her face that extended from ear to ear. I complied, after a kiss and a hug. Undoing the bow and the wrapping brought to light a handcrafted prayer mat with an intricate pattern of black geometric figures set against a dark red background. "That's more than a prayer mat," I said, beholding it with awe. She nodded. "I started weaving this a long time ago," she said softly. "I made it in a kind of dream state. I made it for my future husband, which I realized at the time I might never have. I realized that no man in India would be marrying a woman without wanting to own her like a possession. That's the inescapable part of the marriage game, isn't it? That game wasn't for me. Nevertheless, I kept on weaving this mat. For years I dreamed about a land in which a man and a woman can join hands in a bond designed for no other purpose than to enrich one another's life rather than serving one another. I dreamed about a bond that no priest needs to sanctify, that simply exists because love exists." With this dream in the background, the weaving continued, thread by thread. Sometimes I would come here to the Taj to ponder over what I was doing, to this very place, in the garden, to this very block of stone. It was here, in the serenity that I found here, that I realized one day that what I had been seeking was fundamentally invalid. I had been hoping and dreaming to have my life fulfilled by some prince stepping forth from a magical world, who would uplift me. I was looking for another person to fulfill my life. At this moment I realized that I had been turning the reality of love upside down. I realized that the love that I had been looking for throughout all these years could only exist as an appreciation of myself as a worthy and complete human being. I realized that the love that I was seeking had to come from within me as a response to the riches of the humanity that is already rooted in my heart and unfolds from there. I realized that the love that truly enriches us has to reflect what we truly are, what we see about ourselves, what we love, and what we represent as human beings. I realized that I couldn't get this from another person. I also realized that if I couldn't love myself as a human being for what I was, and for the riches that I have, which are the riches of our humanity, what would cause another person to fall in love with me? I faced a paradox with this. If I couldn't fall in love with myself, why would another person fall in love with me? "So, did you resolve the paradox?" I asked. She began to laugh. "Do you know how I discovered the paradox in the first place? I opened my eye to it here in the garden. I had brought my unfinished prayer mat with me. I had laid it out on this very stone. I imagined that I would give it to someone who would love me and fulfill my dreams. Suddenly I asked myself, who would that be? I looked at the men that I saw in the garden, and I saw the same empty feeling reflected in their eyes that I had in my heart. I realized at this moment that by joining hands with any of these men, we would both remain beggars, begging each other to fulfill one another's life. But with what would we do this? What would we have to share? We would have nothing to share. The result would have become a union of poverty. What riches could unfold from such a union when no one has anything to give? With this startling realization, I realized that what I had been looking for was invalid, and what I had really been looking for hadn't been discovered yet. I had been hoping for a union of hearts overflowing with love, and to be honest, I also realized at this moment that I had been a poor candidate for that. I realized that the kind of marriage that I should have been looking for is really a marriage that unfolds in celebration. I realized that my wedding gift that I had been weaving all these years would have been a gift born from an inner joy out of the riches of myself as a human being, a joy born out of the riches of our humanity. I also realized that this kind of loving would have to start at the home gate and become complete there in order that I would have something worthwhile to share. That's when I realized that I really wouldn't need another person to fulfill my life. I also realized that when a union would eventually unfold, it wouldn't complete anything then, since there would no void remain for another to fulfill, so that the resulting union would be for only one purpose, the purpose of celebration. And guess what, Peter? The celebration is now happening. We are meeting here in time and space not to complete each other, but to celebrate the riches of our being, which we also see reflected in one another. In that celebration we share our love. I feel this is what has been happening between us from the moment you stepped off the plane. And when you leave, a lot of joined us in this celebration will continue on. Our unity can never end, since it is a celebration. All that I could do in my bewilderment was nod and smile. I heard her words, but could barely believe what I heard. No one could have articulated more beautifully what I also felt deep in my heart. She understood me completely. She expressed what I felt down to the deepest recesses of my thoughts and brought it out more precisely than I could have said it, and more simply. Now my prayer mat is complete, and you are here, she said, interrupting my thoughts. Our meeting is the fulfillment of my dream. Our marriage is precisely what a marriage should be, a joining of hands, in the celebration of a profound truth expressed in life. She reached her hand out and then kissed me. I suggested to her that this lovely thought that she shared called for a big embrace. I embrace you forever with my kiss, I said to her, slightly modifying her own greeting. I also made the kiss as much a celebration as it could be. I embrace you forever with my kiss, I repeated. Forever? She asked. Oh yes, since time began, I replied. I can accept that, she said, it is sufficient. She laughed after that. It is fitting then, that I give this prayer mat to you with all my love from the bottom of my heart, and that I give it to you here where we stand together before the greatest temple ever built in the name of love. It certainly has been that to me. Did you know that you just answered a question that I had been asked a long time ago and hadn't been able to answer? I said to her. One of the first things my friend Helen had asked me after I met her was the simple question, what do you wish for the most? I hadn't been able to answer her. She had followed me when I left the pub where I had been. It was late in the night, way past midnight. I had been looking for something that I hadn't found. That's why I had come to the pub in the first place, but I hadn't found it there either. And so I couldn't answer her. Yes, what did I wish for most? What was it that I wanted above all else? Did I want a car? A home? A wife? Sex? I owned a fine car and a more than adequate house. I had a lovely and loving wife. Still something was missing. But what was it? I was tempted to answer that it was sex, but I also knew that this wasn't it either. I was looking for something bigger than that. I realized that if I had wanted sex more than anything I could have bought it quite inexpensively without any hassles. Obviously, I wanted more. I didn't find the answer until the next day. Luckily, Helen had been patient with me. And what was the answer, Peter? Indira asked. Helen presented the answer herself. She told me about a discovery, something profound out of her own experience, a discovery that she had made some time earlier. A dear friend of her had been in hospital undergoing a 5-hour surgery. A short time into this period she had suddenly felt an overwhelming sense of urgency, a cry for help. She knew that her friend has always had a weak heart. She sensed a silent cry for help. In an extreme situation one doesn't have time to reason things out. Instinctively she drew together everything that she knew to be true about human existence and universal principles. It all came together as a surprisingly vivid visual construct. She saw humanity as a vast lattice of human hearts, all of them linked laterally to one another by threads of love, all sending a bit of their own strength in support of her friend. In time the sense of urgency abated. But then, a time later it all repeated itself, and the whole cycle started anew. This happened to her 3 times in succession over the space of almost 3 hours. When the urgency dissipated at the end of the 3rd cycle, a great calm began. The great calm stayed with her for the rest of the day. She told me that the great calm began almost an hour before the surgical procedure was supposed to be completed. Evidently the crisis had been overcome at this point. I told Indira that Helen had visited her friend later that day in the late afternoon. Helen had told me that she had been totally surprised at what she saw. Her friend had been sitting up in bed with a radiant smile that seemed like a miracle so soon after such an extensive surgical operation. Helen realized afterwards, I said to Indira, that the universal lateral lattice that she had visualized illustrates a fundamental universal principle that describes the reality of our being. She suggested to me that what I desired most was to locate myself within this universal lateral lattice, instead of living outside of it. But what does this mean? Asked Indira. I related to Indira what had happened that day in Leipzig. Helen had explained that our greatest need is not to be loved, but to love, and most of all, to love ourselves as the most precious gem in the universe. I told her that Helen had suggested that this kind of love takes one way, beyond what Nicholas of Cusa saw who had searched for the face of truth. It probably takes as far back in time as the biblical John, I said to Indira. In ancient days a man named John had contemplated what the world would be like at the end of all evil. He probably meant with that a kind of world in which all human needs and hopes and wishes are fulfilled. I pointed out to Indira that one of the grandest images that John had envisioned along this line was the image of a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. Here is what Helen said about this image, I added. We are not there yet, Peter, Indira interrupted me, but how shall we know it when we get there? How will we see it? And most importantly, how do we see ourselves in this context? What really is it that we would see in ourselves when we see ourselves as being clothed with the sun? What is it that we would see? What does it mean to be clothed with the sun, in real terms? I had hesitated answering Helen when she asked me that day what I wanted most. I said to Indira. Surely, you can answer this simple question now, Indira said to me, and smiled. I had answered Helen that I often felt quite naked. However, what was it that I had clothed myself with in those days, which was so void of anything real that I felt quite naked? Indeed, I had a lot of that kind of empty stuff on my list. Everything I had done up to that point seemed so inconsequential, so empty of anything real. Even my job appeared like that. I had told Helen that I had become a pawn in a game that someone else was playing. There had been times when I was ashamed of myself to be living that way. I told Helen that I could see in myself a reflection of what the ancient writer might have seen who created the Adam and Eve mythology. The only difference was that I had used a different fig leaf with which to hide my nakedness, my shame. I had been wearing a pinstripe suit, but I felt just as naked as Adam had declared himself to be. So, I fully agreed with the writer of that ancient mythology or satire. I had told Helen that this kind of nakedness puts one into a terrible position. I had also told Helen that I couldn't agree with the ending of the mythological Adam and Eve story. I told her that I would have written the ending differently. I didn't think God would have said to them both, "You disgust me, get out of my sight, get out of my garden, and get out of my paradise." This expulsion wouldn't have been necessary. I would have made the audience to understand that Adam had already kicked himself out of paradise at this point in the story. I suggested to Helen that my greatest need was to find a way to reverse all of that and get back to what Adam had exiled himself from. "You are getting warm," Helen had said to me that day. I said to Indira. "But is your pinstripe fig leaf the only thing that you wear, that you surround yourself with, that makes you feel naked?" She had added, What about all those small-minded measurements, the kind of measurements that kill your soul, that murder your humanity? She had asked. And she was right. Don't we all have mile-long lists of complaints about our society, our world, and ourselves? We are at these around ourselves constantly. We wear them. They become a barrier. They isolate us by being clothed in these heavy garments. We place ourselves outside of the universal lateral lattice that Helen had discovered as the reality of our being, reflecting the principles of our humanity. We isolate ourselves from what we are. Consequently, we find ourselves to be alone. Helen had laughed at this point. I said to Indira. She had asked me, "Do you want to know how to get back into the garden that humanity has largely expelled itself from?" She told me that the answer is simple. She told me to shed all those garments that amount to nothing, and clothe yourself with the sun. Begin to love. That means loving yourself. Love your humanity in all its brightness, as the image of God. If you can't love yourself in that light, how can you love everyone else? The humanity that you love is universal, and you are a part of it. This royally divine humanity is the heart of every human being. That's in essence what she said to me. She also said to me, if you truly love yourself, you automatically love the whole of humanity, because there is only one humanity that we all share, and one universal human soul that is expressed in all of us. To love yourself is universal love, and any other form of love has no validity. Helen said that any other form of love is like a badly written play that doesn't work. The universal lateral lattice that defines the reality of our being is the most correctly written image of love that I know. That's what Helen had said. In it we are all clothed with the sun. We should find ourselves in that lattice, Indira, and not try to live outside of it. And that includes everything that we are. It includes the whole range of our humanity. That's the sun. Indira nodded. Yes, this is our greatest need, to be clothed with the sun, said Indira. Helen had told me then not to feel too badly that I hadn't recognized this at first. You are not alone in this, she had said. The whole of humanity is far from recognizing its most urgent need, which is to locate itself in the lateral lattice, as someone clothed with the sun of self-love. For this lack of recognition, humanity has not yet begun to take the needed steps in fulfilling its most urgent need. The Apostle John in ancient times seems to have felt that it is inevitable for us to take these footsteps one day. He probably realized that when we do this, we will recognize that we do have dominion, not over one another as many now seek to have dominion, but over the earth and all that surrounds it, and mostly over ourselves and over our small-minded thinking. Then, as we recognize ourselves in this manner, we will discover that the stars in our crown will be the sparking points of principle in our crown of rejoicing. Oh, but you are wrong on one count, I had countered Helen that morning. You can no longer speak of the whole of humanity in this way. Here in this room, with you, Helen, the sunrise has already begun. The discovery of ourselves has begun, and is unfolding. Helen had begun to laugh at my comment. No, Peter, she had said, I asked you what you desired most in your life, and you couldn't answer. You were completely honest, because the core of the answer, that is rooted in the lateral lattice, was still unknown to you. You were searching for the substance of it and its reality, but you could not define it. In a lateral relationship, we are all at one with another. You were trying to find yourself into this lateral lattice unity. You could feel its essence, but you could not put your finger on it. All this was yesterday, I had answered Helen emphatically. I had told Helen that when the first atomic bomb was dropped, the world had been changed for all times to come, because the knowledge to build the atomic bombs would not go away. However, I had suggested that mankind would one day find a way to live with this knowledge without any danger of blowing one another up. I had also told her that the world was changed again when she recognized for the first time in history the principle of the lateral lattice as the reality of our being. I had suggested to Helen that none of us could back away from this kind of knowledge either. A discovered principle remains applicable for all times, once it has been developed and understood. An understanding of truth remains forever with us and transforms us and enriches us further. And so the door to a new world has been opened for me by you, I had said to her. The sunrise has begun, or maybe just the dawn has begun, but one way or another the full sunshine is inevitable now. I told Indira that Helen had called the sunshine of our self-love our joy. The process of our being clothed with the sun is our joy. I told her that the process that unfolds in the lateral lattice is our universal kiss born out with a great joy. That's where the concept of the universal kiss came from, I said to Indira. Helen had formulated this concept on very day when she tried to explain the underlying principle of the lateral lattice to me. The discovery of the lateral lattice makes us all incredibly rich, doesn't it? One won't find any beggars there, begging each other. That's impossible in the environment of the universal kiss and in the sunshine of our self-love. The dancing then becomes natural, as the festival of our private dancing already is. Indira responded silently with a nod that became a smile, which ended with a tight embrace and a long drawn-out kiss. The Taj Mahal wasn't built for beggars, she said. She invited me to walk with her along the edge of the long reflecting pool. But as soon as we reached the raised supply pool in the center of the garden, she stopped me. She pointed to the dome of the great white building. Look at the dome, she said. She continued pointing to it. That's not a regular dome, is it? It's got a bulge part way up. Nor is it an onion dome of the kind that one finds on Russian churches. The dome that we see here is made in the shape of a woman's breast. Look, Peter. The breast that the dome represents is complete with an areola on top, and a nipple at the center that sprouts from it into a fountain of joy. And far below the great breast, rising from the base on which the building stands, rises the great portico with its rounded top. The portico with its round top symbolically houses the clitoris. See, the portico is divided by two windows, one above the other. The lower one, which extends only part way up, represents the sleeping clitoris. And upper one that reaches 3/4 way up represents the aroused clitoris. The dome of the portico is its protective hood. And way below all of that lies the long narrow slit of the rest of the vulva. That's represented by the long reflecting pool, isn't it? The immediate edge of the reflecting pool is narrow. It represents a woman's thin inner labia, while the wide outer edge, the walkways on either side, are wide. The walkways represent the outer labia. And in between the wide and narrow edges of the pool is a narrow garden planted. And then look, Peter, what happens at the center, where we stand, where the long reflecting pools meet up with the raised pool? The entire scene widens outwards. It widens at the center. Note, Peter, how the inner and outer edges are pushed outwards from the center as well, like the labia of the women's vulva often expand outwardly at the center. Then look at what the designers have set up at the very epicenter of the widened area. They have set up a central raise that serves as a supply vessel that feeds all the reflecting pools. The supply vessel is called the celestial pool of abundance, where the designers say that man meets God. This means, Peter, that the entire structure of the Taj and its garden is truly the greatest temple of love ever built, and not one iota is left out that is an inherent part of the sexual elements of love. The entire huge temple structure and its garden is one giant vulva that has a woman's breast towering high above it, and you might note that we are standing right in the middle of it. You and I, only the name doesn't quite fit. The whole complex together should be called the Taj Mahal, she added, and began to laugh. You're quite a little devil, aren't you? I interjected, and punched her gently. You certainly have a far-reaching imagination. You are seeing connections here that nobody has seen before. But am I not right? She said with a grin. Isn't the view that you see here the same view that you men get in lovemaking, with a woman's breast towering above the scene? The perspective is about the same, isn't it? She said, and laughed. The Taj is a temple, Peter, and a temple is built for celebration, and the center of celebration here is the universal kiss. But the Taj has only one breast, I said, and joined her laughter. And there is another thing that doesn't quite fit your analogy. The two reflecting poles that go off to the right and the left in right angles don't fit. They divide the garden in half horizontally. They don't quite fit into the pattern of the scenery that you have described. Oh, don't they? Indira countered me and grinned again. What goes off in right angles from the center of the vulva? What extends from there to the right and to the left and is an inherent part of the erotic scenery surrounding the vulva? Wouldn't those extensions be a woman's inner thighs? That's what the right and left poles represent. So you see, Peter, it's all represented here. Nothing is missing. I think Shah Jahan knew exactly what he was building. He built a giant vulva, one so big that one can't stand in it, and celebrate that our humanity has a divine origin, including every part of it, she said, and laughed, and kissed me, and now I invite you to stand in it with me hand in hand, she added, and laughed some more. I began joining in. That's certainly an exciting wedding scene, I said moments later, and grinned. It's the one spot where the whole of humanity meets and bridges the gap between the male and the female, and where indeed everyone's journey in life began. And so, I would say that you are right, the center, if the Taj is a perfect place to start a profound universal marriage celebration, a kind of profound revisiting of the truth. I paused and smiled at her. Do you know what this means? I added. What could this possibly mean, Peter? Is there anything that's missing from our celebration? I nodded. Consider what John saw in his moments of profound revelation. He saw a woman, clothed with the sun, not a vulva. He took the vulva and raised it to vastly higher ground. He raised it to orders of magnitude. And that requires us, as we stand in the middle of the vulva and celebrate its dimension, that we extend our vision into the complex domain of truth that lies far beyond the sensual scapes of things. No physical eye has ever seen a truth, or a principle, or love, or all the wonderful things that make us human and divine at the same instant, as if we lived in two parallel universes that are merging into one, the physically visual and the soul-filled universe, where we begin to see with the mind's eye. That merging of the sensual with the profound is a part of our universal marriage festival too, isn't it? And that requires a special acknowledgement, and a special present that goes with it, a present that represents both the sensual and the profound in a complex union. What could this possibly be? Said Indira. My present to you is a new name for yourself if you will accept it, I answered, facing her. May I propose that you accept the name, Sharon's Rose? The term is rooted in poetry. It is a term coined long ago for the profusion of flowers that grace the woods of the plain of Sharon in biblical times. In this sense it represents a visual and sensual delight. But it also has a historic dimension in which it gains a spiritual significance with a profound scientific characteristic. The term, Sharon's Rose, is rarely used in modern time. I only know of one poem where it is used. But oh, how it is used there. The poem is over 100 years old by a great sage and Christian healer with a scientific dimension. The sage is a woman from one of the New England states. And the poem itself is a part of a great scientific platform that she has created, which is divided into 16 parts, just as the Garden of the Taj is divided into 16 parts. The poem has 16 verses. One of the verses has at its core the spiritual dimension of Sharon's Rose. The verse goes like that. Christ was not crucified, that doom was Jesus' part. For Sharon's rose must bud and bloom in human heart. Star. STAR''God was manifest in the flesh. St. Paul. Doesn't the sage's usage of the term open up a world of meaning that raises the human, without stepping on it, to the level of the divine? I think that if you accept the name, Sharon's Rose, you will never lose the slightest aspect of your humanity in which the sensual and spiritual merge, and the human and the divine become one, I said to her. What you propose is beautiful, Indira said with a kiss, and I will gladly bear the name, as gladly as I would bear our child, if that became appropriate, as someday it will. But for now, maybe both should be kept in reserve. I treasure the name you gave me, and in order to keep it precious allow me to attach it to the name by which everyone knows me. I would be honored to be named Sharon's Rose Indira. And furthermore, doing that would allow me to add this special name to your name as well, naming you affectionately and most intimately Sharon's Rose Peter. Oh, I accept that, I said with joy and with a kiss. So tell me more about this poem, or this verse, said Indira. Surely you know more. The poem is too big, I said. And the sage is Mary, of course, the Mary Baker Eddy, who is both a scientist and a metaphysical healer. And that is too big a subject again. But the verse isn't that big, though it has a special place within the poem and within Mary's work. A vast scene flows into that verse. It comprises everything that we represent between us and which we treasure. The sage draws into its flow the dimensions of science, theology, medicine, and also sex. Doesn't that include every major aspect that unites us? She must have been a rare genius, that woman, to have included sex, and to have done it in the 1880s. What a daredevil she must have been, said Indira. Oh, the truth demands whatever the truth demands, I replied. The sage, being a scientist also, had no choice in the matter. Most sages that speak the truth seem daring for it, especially when they stand up in an age of rigid religion. And Mary did warn about indulging sensuality as an empty pursuit, evidently because the sensual universe is incomplete. If we only look at the world with what the physical eye conveys to us, we box ourselves into a small and confined space. The sensual universe is like that in all its aspects, if it is pursued by itself. But when we take the sensual and uplift it in the complex domain, where we begin to look upon the world with the mind's eyes, we discern principles the physical eye can never see, and freedoms that the sensual world by itself can never comprehend. The sensual world by itself is an enigma, a paradox, without a solution. That is why so many religions spit on sex, and stomp on it as something shameful, while the priests that are honest with themselves can't get away from sex no matter how hard they try. That tells me that there is no resolution to the paradox possible until one takes the sexual scene into the spiritual dimension. It appears that this is what the ancient Hindus must have done in building the Taj, and building it into the largest single erotic construct that has ever been created in the history of mankind, I said, and began laughing with her. Do you think we are the only people crazy enough or wise enough to see the Taj that way? She interjected. Crazy, no. Wise, maybe, I replied. Still, I must admit the thought is exciting and intriguing that we are standing here and walking around in a giant symbolic vulva, nicely crowned with the most perfectly shaped breast towering high above us. Does that make us crazy? I would say no, nor do I think we are the only people here to see what lays before us. Others can probably see the same that we see, but can't admit it to themselves, which drives them crazy. I began to grin. Evidently the scenery before us is not unfamiliar to you, Indira interjected. That's something that I can personally testify to, she added with a giggle. So you must agree that the Taj Mahal is certainly the largest temple to erotic love that has ever been created, she said, and laughed. And you are right, we can't be the only ones seeing the Taj in that way. The view before is probably familiar to any man who ever walked though its gate. Do you think we should ask the question? I said in a joking manner. Don't even think of it, unless you're suicidal, she replied. Such a suggestion would be an insult to Islam. Everyone sees the Taj as a moral temple, and thereby a temple of Islam. It wouldn't be an insult if it was a Hindu temple, I said cautiously. In this it would merely be the largest erotic temple ever built, and nothing more than that. In fact, the Chandela temples of Khajuraho are much larger in quantity of erotic expressions. Still, it's intriguing to come here to the Taj, isn't it, and to become a part of the erotic dimension by standing right in the middle of it. The eroticism is in the beholder. If it is paradox there, then all that people will see is a beautiful, white, marble structure, said Indira. But we don't see it as a paradox, I interjected. That's a bit of an understatement, she said, and grinned. This place has it all. It's all here, the wine, the chocolate, and the roses. I won't even ask you as to what represents what, I said and smiled. It all fits together in every way you care to make it fit, she said. This means we have our wine, chocolate, and roses celebration once again in a still different dimension, I said, enriching our private festival of Cunningless once again. The celebration doesn't seem to end. Oh, you, she said, and punched me gently. Of course you are right, why should it end, my precious Sharon's Rose Peter? She said, and embraced me once more. Why should it end, she repeated. She took me by the hand and started to walk again. Of course the cunning and the cunningless is all you're doing, she added. Doesn't one have to come to the temple first before the celebration can begin, my beautiful and free Sharon's Rose Indira? I said, reaching for her hand. The keeper of the temple requires an invitation to open the door. There was a time long ago in Argentina when great riches were to be had and people flocked there from Europe. But the riches came at a price for most of them, as the immigrant men outnumbered the women by a wide margin. The price was paid in the bordellos, the only places where most men could fulfill their most honest desires intimately. However, before that could happen, the men had to prove to the lady that they were worthy of the lady's intimate affection. And in order to do that, they had to dance with the chosen lady of the night 4 times, successfully, and inspire her with their wit. The competition was stiff. The dancing became a contest of skill, dexterity, the rhythm of the heart, and a daring to be honest in their intention. Out of this background the tango emerged as the most erotic dance form ever devised. The cunning that assured their success was assigned to the men by the nature of the game. The men all knew that they had to measure up to a standard that was never clearly defined except in the heart. Consequently, the men were honing their dancing skills and whatever other skills, charms, and cunning they could muster to make the best impression they could. They would be often seen practicing their dance steps out on the streets, sometimes in competition with each other, and of course everybody knew what it was for, because to fail meant that they had to forego an intimacy that was precious. The keeper of the temple, it seems to me, is wise to require the kind of skillful invitation that conveys the sense of awe and wonder that a temple celebration should engender. No one should enter a temple lightly, even to rob it. There is no joy in that. A temple is rich only by what one brings into it, and that should be conveyed with care. So, I would say the cunning is with oneself to overcome the deadening sense of self-doubt, and whatever else would block the great Renaissance principle of striving for the advantage of the other that brings light to the temple. Unfortunately, this Renaissance principle has been lost sight of in every regard. We need to re-establish it in all ways possible. I paused. Did I do my dancing well? Have I succeeded in conveying to you how special you are to me? She responded, as I had hoped she would. Long after our embrace ended, that grew out of our conversation, when we were sitting down again afterwards, Indira reached for my hand and held it tight, gently. The woman, Mahal, she said, to whom this temple is dedicated, was probably not as fortunate as I am today. It is such a joy to be touched by all of the wonders that we share. The idea of the universal kiss that your friend Helen brought to light seems richer now than anything that the richest monarch could have bought. What is unfolding here assures me that I am able to love you and anyone else as freely as a bird, and that our love can mingle on this endless plane unconditionally. Universal means unconditional, doesn't it? And so it has to be, if love is not dependent on one another, by which it would surround us with conditions. This freedom in love is a kind of love that the woman Mahal might have never known or experienced. We can walk in the garden of the vulva together. We can dance there freely and openly. Compared with that kind of freedom, it appears the Mumtaz had been a beggar feeding of her king. But we, you and I, are aware of that now. This awareness makes both us richer than the great Mahal had been, whose name can be interpreted as the pearl of the palace. Love has to be as free like a bird, or else it isn't love, and love is a lie, I replied. Love cannot be conditional, because true love doesn't depend on anyone outside of ourselves. Our love is the fire of our own heart. We are surrounded by it. It seems that Mumtaz had to fight for it. She sold herself. No woman wants to be a mother 14 times. I believe this is an aspect of a higher truth, the kind that even the emperor himself had not been aware of, said Indira. This higher truth comes to light only in the dimension of our higher scientific perception, the kind which exists on a higher plane than the emotional sphere. I nodded to Indira and squeezed her hand in return. You told me yesterday that the woman Mahal, to whom this temple has been dedicated, bore the emperor 13 children in 13 years, and that she died during the birth of her 14th child. This tells me that she played the role of the emperor's most beloved wife in the role of a slave. I suppose the emperor had many wives. It would have been difficult, therefore, for her not to be in competition with all the other wives and to become enslaved by this competition. Evidently she herself had shaped the competition into her favor with her ability to give the emperor children. This may have compensated for what she hadn't been rich enough to give him in terms of sharing the riches of her self-love. But that is the real face of love, as you have put it yourself. If Mumtaz had stood in the sphere of that fire of love from within, she would not have stood in the sphere of a competition, or in the sphere of being a sex slave to her master, but would have lived in the sunshine of the universal kiss. I can't see that something doesn't fit here. The erotic dimension, the actions of the Shah, the actions of Mumtaz, none of them fit together like pieces from different puzzles. I have no doubt that Mumtaz was dear to him, said Indira in reply. I also have no doubts that she lost her life over circumstances that resulted directly from conditions that she lacked the resources to alter. I suspect that the emperor might have sensed this somewhat in his grief. I even believe that the Taj Mahal might have been built by the emperor to give her in death what he, too, had been unable to give her in life, a love that is unconditional. You may be right, I agreed, though the truth will never be known, will it? But it might also be that there was no love involved at all, so that every aspect of it was just a political game. As you have pointed out, unconditional, universal love is probably the hardest form of love to achieve, because one has to find its riches in oneself, which makes it the only true form of it. The emperor doesn't make that grade. The 14 children don't add up. They don't fit into the dimension of love. Would you want to be called the pearl of the palace? Indira shook her head. There was a time when I would have shouted for joy. Thank God this didn't happen. The dream has been buried in the trash can of useless pursuits. But I would suggest that as our higher goal is more fully reached, which our festival of celebrations is already moving us towards, and we experience more and more of the beautiful substance of love, we might eventually be infecting the whole world with it and in the flow see the end of all evil as a tangible reality. I can imagine that the Taj Mahal as a temple of love might be linked to this. An undeniable linkage does already exist in more ways than one, and quite obviously so. Indira looked at me in a questioning way. What linkage? That's a long story, Indira, I replied. In the last chapter of the book that this man John wrote, who visualized the woman clothed with the sun, he visualized another abstract metaphor that is also related to the end of all evil. He visualized a four-square matrix descending from God out of heaven, a city of ideas laid out foursquare. Now guess what we have right here before us? We have the exact same geometric structure embedded in the design of the Taj Mahal, and in the very garden that we are in. A four-square geometric matrix has 16 elements. You find all of that in the garden here. The garden is a four-square structure. The entire garden is divided into 4 giant squares that are themselves divided into 4 squares. This geometric division creates exactly 16 elements. You may also remember that we were told, as we came in, that there are 16 different kinds of flowers planted in the garden. I must therefore conclude that the Taj Mahal may not have been primarily designed to be a tomb. Rather, it appears to have been designed to represent the ultimate challenge to humanity, the burial of all evil through scientific development. It might have been so created in order to allow the divine element of love in our humanity to be recognized as universal and unconditional force, in the hope that it unfolds in the same context by which evil vanishes from sight. Evidently, this all cannot be accomplished without a scientific foundation and scientific development. Nothing less than that could ever offer the potential to do that. So you see, Indira, our individual spiritual riches, the Taj Mahal, and the end of all evil are linked in some profound way. Could we find a better place than to celebrate our mutual commitment to the universal cause and its constantly widening dimension? Wow. Indira replied after a moment of silence. I long suspected that there is something special about the Taj, but what you just said really makes things hang together. It all hangs together so beautifully that it must be true. And yes, there is no better place than this to celebrate our universal kiss. It actually doesn't really matter whether or not the design of the garden was intended for this purpose, I added. What matters is what we see in it. It could have all come together accidentally, though I doubt that. The fact remains that we have a temple before us that is built to honor love. This is an apparent fact. The design of the garden probably elaborates what the whole project has been built on. It combines the dimension of science with the vulva and spreads the vulva all the way through it as if the two cannot be separated. It combines the spiritual force and the corporeal expression of it. That is why the design incorporates patterns representative of science that can be linked to a holy man's vision of the end of all evil, which also reflects the ancient understanding that love and the human intellect are one, meaning that they can't truly exist in isolation from each other. This, too, is an undeniable fact. Furthermore, we have a construction of such incredible beauty built on that foundation that it is regarded as one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world. In my estimation, if one adds all of this up, the sum total symbolizes the greatest challenge to humanity of all times, to create a platform for universal and unconditional love that promises to put an end to all evil. That is what I saw coming to light here, whether this was intended to be symbolized or not. That's the challenge that I recognize here. That's the way I see it. The official story evidently is wrong. Lots of people would disagree with me, but everything that I see here reflects this higher sense of love that I have come to value. To me, this is all that matters. I am prepared to kneel down before this momentous challenge that the principle of universal love lays before us. I am prepared to kneel before this great symbolic achievement that I see erected here on mankind's road towards meeting this challenge. It would give me a great joy to kneel down with you on our prayer mat before this principle by which this greatest challenge can be met, and dedicate my life to it side by side with you. I also realize that I have been doing this for some time already, without knowing it. At least it seems so, now. So, what do you think? Are you ready to celebrate this commitment in prayer? She nodded. But what about your background in the ceremony of prayer? Have you ever done this formally, on a prayer mat? No, I have never owned a prayer mat, and probably neither have you, I replied. So, let's do it now. Let's do it together, but let's not do this in the mosque. Let's do it here, right in the garden, at the very center of it, at the very center of the vulva. Why not in a mosque, Peter? The building to the left of the tomb is a mosque. Did you know that? She pointed it out. A mosque is not suitable, I said, because in a mosque one is oriented towards Mecca. I want our prayer to be on a higher platform than that. I want our prayer mat to be oriented towards the tomb. I want to kneel down right smack in the middle of the 4-square garden, facing the Taj, because the garden is the key element in the whole equation. Its metaphor is the key because it represents the universal scientific development that is essential for putting an end to all evil. The 4-square garden symbolizes life, the advancement of science. Mecca doesn't symbolize that. A tomb represents burial, the burial of all that is small and thinking, and archaic, and decaying and superseded. It symbolizes the burial of all those lower things of which my friend Helen would say, what have they got to do with anything? On these two pillows, science and burial, rests the development of universal, unconditional love. That's the process by which the tomb becomes a temple of love. The incredible beauty of the Taj's structure before us symbolizes the outcome of this process of burial that culminates into love. That's what we should be facing towards, rather than towards Mecca. We should be doing this today, and for all times to come. Yes, I will gladly join you at the center of the garden, said Indira, with a smile. She stood up and reached her hand out. Let's do it now, together, as you suggested. Let's do it hand in hand. Let this prayer be our wedding prayer that acknowledges openly what we have discovered about ourselves and the whole of mankind. Indeed, this is what we did. We kneeled down on our mat on the surrounding edge of the central reflecting pool, at the very center of the garden, on the edge of the celestial pool of abundance, where man meets God, facing the Taj as a temple of love. As Indira had pointed out earlier, the great marble structure of the Taj did indeed appear to float above the surface of the water that reflected the brilliance of the sky and the brilliance of the Taj. In this sense, the Taj itself appeared as if it were clothed with the sun. It seemed to me that we might have started a whole new tradition with our prayer in the garden. When I looked up, I realized that we were not the only ones kneeling down before the Taj. A tomb represents burial, I said aloud to the others who were kneeling down with us. It represents the burial of dead rights, perverted customs, false axioms, notions that divide people, institutions that create untouchable people, and poverty that creates slaves who are forced to live in servitude all the days of their lives. But the beauty of the Taj represents the real force of life. That's not a prayer, someone said. Yes, it is a prayer, I replied. It is the prayer of truth to banish ignorance, to bury it. What else would one celebrate when one is facing a tomb? To me, the Taj is a place for joyous celebration, as it prefigures the end of all evil, and the burial of it, forever. And that makes it also a Mughal prayer, added Indira. When the woman Arjumand Banu married Prince Khurram, she took on the new name of Mumtaz Mahal, which means the chosen of the palace. Likewise, when the prince became crowned, he took on the new name, Shah Jahan, meaning the king of the world. Perhaps as we bury the past, and its empires and political games that we have outgrown, as we grow up spiritually and scientifically, as we look to the future in a way that dedicates our lives to creating a monument to love and truth that is greater than the Taj, a monument not made with men's hands, or even the outcome of their heart, which gives to the material a spiritual significance, unfolding in beauty and goodness. That's love catching a glimpse of glory. When I finished speaking, we both stood up. I kissed Indira and rolled up our prayer mat. Then we turned to walk away. Did anyone understand what I said? I asked Indira while we were still on the platform. She nodded. I understood you, she said. Is that not enough?